Beth's plant choices were guided by Andrew's research into wild plant communities, as Dave talked about earlier, but also by her constant assessment of plants in the nursery and garden for form, color, garden performance, and so on. So I think it's absolutely fitting that our next panelists will discuss how they trial and select plants for their nurseries and gardens, taking into consideration ecological functionality and garden worthiness. Joining Taylor on stage will be Marina Christopher, Asa Gregers-Warg, Peter Jonker, and Peter Korn. You've already met Asa and Peter Korn, but let me introduce you to Marina and Peter Jonker. Marina is the owner of Phoenix Perennial Plants, a nursery growing hardy and unusual plants. With a background in biology and ecology, it is no surprise that the nursery's emphasis is on providing plants for a balanced ecosystem of benefit to wildlife. With decades of experience behind her, Marina regularly supplies plants to top garden designers, and her plants are often trend-setting at Chelsea Flower Show. We have Marina to thank for the surge of interest in the delicate pink poppy known as Beth's poppy. Peter Jonker is a garden designer, nurseryman, and florist. Ecological concerns are a key part of his work as a garden designer and influences plant lists at his nursery Hortus, which specializes in herbaceous plants, grasses, and bulbs, many of them lesser-known species. Inspired by his time spent volunteering at Beth Chatto's in 2003 and 2004, he grows over 4,000 different plants in his garden without irrigation. Welcome Marina, Peter Jonker, Asa, Peter Korn, and Taylor.
All right. So this is really a question for everyone on the panel. Feel free to chime in. But I really want to know, do you feel that designers are really well prepared to understand the building blocks of ecological gardens? And if not, what can they do to better understand?
Ooh. There's certainly some designers that are really on board, but I think we come across quite a few as we've come across designers who don't really seem to know, they haven't got the palette of plants, they haven't got the true understanding of the right conditions, you know, the necessity is more about the design bit.
I think that not for every designer, the goal is to have an eco-conscious garden in the end. When you think of just the fact that money plays a great role in the green business. In former times, you had designers just putting in Acer palmatums, rhododendrons, azaleas, and so on, although they know other plants. But these plants, like the Acer palmatum, are very, very high in price. So there was a subculture of gardening using just what was very expensive to have a huge amount of money in the end, which you can charge.
It would appear that many design courses... oh, am I not on?
Try again. Try and just speak.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that several design courses may not focus on plants particularly. And also, when a designer is thinking about the plants they might use, they really need to go to one place to get these plants. And I think that if they were selecting plants ecologically and there were several nurseries they needed to go to, that may be a reason why they're not particularly thinking in those terms, and it's more what they can get, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're ecologically based. So I think that might be a problem.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but you really need to know your plants to be able to use them. But then when you want to use them, you can't buy them. That's the problem.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So actually...
Sorry, Peter,
please.
would you say that some designers are afraid of the use of plants because they don't know enough of plants?
Yes, you
so
take the...
think, oh, nice, but better not for my customers because I don't want to
they
have
use
a phone
the safe
call.
ones. And
yeah.
The 30 most common, you see them everywhere.
Interesting. So, this Peter. Peter, you mentioned that all gardens really are trials, which is a really interesting point. But do you all feel that trialing outside of specific garden projects is an important part of your process. How do you anticipate what a plant might do under specific site conditions?
Yeah, but you really need to know your plants and try them yourself. You can try them at customers' places, but then that's a risk, and you don't go there all the time. But if you grow them yourself, you can follow them the whole year and see how they look when they come up and when they go dormant, and also comparing different varieties. If you buy heleniums from Holland, they are all 70 centimeter in the list, but when you grow them, they are 50 to 160. And some of them flower for 2 weeks and some for 2 months. And if you just Google a picture of the flowers, it don't say anything. Even if you know how to grow it, you need to grow that variety.
I think in this country it's really quite good. We have RHS Wisley and we do a lot of trials there. More trials are being done elsewhere as well now, which is good. Quite often we have duplicate trials. And I think that if you want to have a look at a good plant, then to go to a trial and see a load together and see how they're growing, whether they've got disease, that sort of thing is really helpful. So I think the trials, the RHS trials, are very useful to select things that might work well. Also, in Britain, we have the Plant Finder, and plants that receive the AGM, the Award of Garden Merit, that does suggest that that plant is actually quite a good plant. Because it has been trialled and it has been selected as being good for all sorts of characters. So also in Europe, there are quite a lot of trials. I think that's a good place to start. But also you've got to think of the conditions. And as Peter says, you need to know your plants.
But even if you know your plants for your place, for your garden, or even for your area where you live, that doesn't seriously mean that this will work in other gardens in the same country. And trials are, in my idea, the best way we have to check plants. But you have to do these plant trails in different parts of every country.
Yes.
And we do have a very long tradition in trialing plants in Germany as well. And when you read what they find out, it's amazing. For example, I read a trial about Hydrangea paniculata and varieties which are in northern Germany with loads of rainfall, let's say 2.50 meters. In other parts, like eastern Germany, they are 80 centimeters.
Yes.
So that is another thing you have to know.
You have to know your own conditions too.
True. Oh yes.
Yes.
Start with that.
Yes.
Yeah. As we heard earlier too, plants operate differently in competition. Do you ever find yourself trialing plants as combinations or using specific mediums, or is it quite literally the RHS trials with one sort of medium for everything all lined out?
Well, I tend to use plants that have got the kind of similar vigor. And if you group plants of similar vigor, they work well. If you, I call them, I do a lecture called Thugs and Wimps. And basically, the thugs are the ones that can, you know, muscle their way amongst each other. For instance, North American plants, Eupatorium, Vernonia, Miscanthus, all of those are big, muscular plants. Whereas I find quite a lot of heleniums and some of the other smaller herbaceous are not as physically vigorous. And so they don't do well if you stick them with a Vernonia. So, yes, I mean, it's well, I'll
well, I think even
else,
if we don't have official areas where we trial plants, you know, it's our responsibility, if we've got a nursery and we're actually selling these plants, we're introducing new-ish, or at least new to us, plants to customers. You know, we want to be able, from a gardener's point of view, we're a very small team of gardeners. I certainly don't want to introduce anything to our garden which is extremely aggressive, or, you know, a self-seeder can be great, but not if it takes over the whole garden. Marina might disagree with me because you might see it from a propagation point of view, but from a gardener's point of view, that's really important. So I think getting to know the plants is, you know, key we really need to know that the plants we're growing before we start introducing them to the
So
wider
say
public.
putting it in a vegetable plot or a part of the garden where it's not important at the beginning to check to see what it's doing.
But sometimes we just put it straight in the garden and just observe it before we actually start selling it, which makes me very unpopular with the nursery because everybody is asking about the plants and obviously wants to get it. But sometimes you need to give it a season or two to see what the plant is doing.
Interesting.
Yeah, but also when even if you find that out and you know exactly what you should do, it's not always easy to say customers that is your way for the garden. For example, Kassian spoke about filling plants, and I love that idea. So you have a design with some very slow-growing plants, and others are quicker, but they die younger. So you could, if you are good, you could design a garden which is already in the first or second year, okay, then brilliant, and very stable over years, but it will change. And then you do have the problem that how can you explain that to customers? Because the annuals from the first year, they had been so pretty. And in the second or third year, they are less. And in the fifth year, they are gone. So they ring you. So I think to train gardeners is one important thing. But we have to train our customers as well. I think that's very,
Yes.
very important.
I mean, gardens are dynamic. They need to change. We want them to evolve.
We want
Yes.
that, yes.
We need to get that over to our customers that is what's going to happen. They're not going to have a picture that's going to stay the same year after year. I mean, with our climate, we're going to have a different season each year. Each year, we will have a different sort of response in the garden.
Are you finding yourself trying to educate your customers with signs or specific information on plant tags? How do you approach that idea of educating a client or a customer?
It's easy when you have a customer which is a designing customer, meaning so I'm the designer and I can charge them for advising them. But when we have customers just popping into the nursery, that's the trickier thing.
Right.
You can spend hours and hours, days, weeks of explaining about plants, and in the end, they turn out, well, okay, I take one, maybe two, no, one is enough, I try it. So,
Right.
It's, and you do have good days and bad days
Sure.
in the nursery, of course. On good days, you think, you wanted to go into the office and do all these VAT things, but no. Explaining something about plants is much more fun and so on, but it can annoy as well. But if I have some customers, so many laugh, so everybody knows that. But if I think, this one is worth explaining things, I do it in the nursery, yeah.
Either of you have anything to
Yeah,
add?
then you explain to them it has to have these conditions, and then they go home and try to find a gap somewhere and put it down.
I think no, that's mean, but when they arrive at home, they didn't know anymore what I said.
But so many labels will say something like April pink, 15 inches. What does that say? Nothing.
Right.
But if you do put a really big tag on it, then people pull the tag out, read it, and then put it somewhere else.
True.
In another pot.
You know,
In
so
other
often,
pots.
yes.
There's no real...
It's very difficult getting that, talking about a plant. In the olden days, I used to find that we used to talk to our customers more. Now they tend to take the tag out and don't actually engage with the nurseryman.
Curious.
So I find that sad because that's what we're the experts. So
Right.
we should be used more often as the experts and listened to.
Got a good audience today. I'd like to ask you about garden worthiness, which really could be the subject of an entire symposia in itself. But you're clearly selecting plants for your nurseries that have specific traits, and we've heard a few today: allelopathic plants, things that are longer lived. What are you selecting for? How would you describe that in terms of plant traits?
I suppose, I mean, right from the start, Beth decided to go for more species or species-like plants, so nothing that's too overbred, that's lost its true character, and looking at good foliage,
lack of pests and diseases.
lack of pests and diseases, obviously, yes.
Lack of staking, probably.
Lack of what?
Staking.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
Yes, things that self-support.
But
But a good selling plant or a good plant, that's totally different.
Yeah,
Exactly, and I've
Can
got
be
an
the same.
example for that, for both of that. Good selling plant, for example, is Sanguisawa pink squirrel, but it's a nonsense plant in the garden because it's so floppy.
It's perfect in sunbeds. I
Yeah,
use it all the time. It's one of my favorite plants.
And it's
And
not that
it stays
big.
nice seed heads in the winter, and it's a very good plant.
Okay, so next to cactus. Good, Peter. I will try that. But the other question was with some of the floppy plants. Are they floppy because they are used in nature to have more neighbors, so they don't stand on their own feet? And that was a question with some grasses I grow, which are truly beautiful, but when I put them in a bed with just low cushion plants around them, they flop. And that is another thing I just want to trial in my garden. So it never stops trialing with plants in your own garden to make new designs.
Interesting. Peter, you were one of the only speakers to address genetic diversity in the landscape, and you mentioned it in the context of trying to increase aesthetic appeal, different colors. Do you, any
Can
of
you
you...
do that in simple English, please?
Sorry. Sorry. You mentioned growing plants out from seed, potentially, to try to get different colors, and not using clonal types. And I think genetic diversity in these landscapes that we've been discussing is a point that we don't often hear about. And I wonder if all of you think about this, if you are considering self-sterile clones only, or are you worried about introducing weediness problems by growing from seed and so forth?
I mean, it can be, a positive thing if it's not seeding everywhere. But I wouldn't say that we go out and specifically look for it.
I grow a lot of plants from seeds, so I think that's the best way to get plants. And you get the variation. Some of them are better, and then I propagate them.
I think getting seeds from different seed sources.
Yeah.
So I quite often will get the same seed from 2 totally different wild collected sources, and they've got variability.
Yeah.
There is genetic variability.
And the picture Peter showed with different tones of yellows, that is superb. And how can you find so many varieties of that same plant to fake that effect? So in my idea is a plant which sows itself into the garden, a super thing. But there are exceptions. Think of Lysichiton, for example. And Lysichiton americanus is banned now, as you know. And the sterile hybrid Lysichiton hortensis, that is a super plant because it is sterile and you are allowed to use it, that wonderful foliage plant.
Do you think there's a relationship between sterility and pollinator appeal in gardens?
Some plants are sterile, not producing seed, but still have nectar. And I was lucky enough to have hardy verbena from North America in a batch of McDougallii seed, what seems to be a sterile hybrid between perhaps McDougallii and her starter. It's got plenty of nectar, the bees love it, but it doesn't spread. I can't grow verbena bonariensis. My site is too wet and cold for it in the winter. So I go for the hardy ones, and this has been an absolute champion. Totally hardy, good in Europe, and 5 to 6 foot, full of bees, but sterile. So an important garden plant. And I think the thing that also would say is that a lot of good nursery plants are perhaps not good garden plants because they seed around, perhaps.
That's very true, and you know, you have to be very, very careful when you then propagate by seed, so you don't have all these. You know, you can't promise a customer a certain color and then it comes out completely different. So that's where we have to be really careful. In the garden setting itself, it doesn't matter so much because then you might actually appreciate that variation.
Mm-hmm. But hybridization too,
absolutely,
between species, yes.
Yeah.
Are you fully on board with the idea of hybrids in ecological gardens, or do you feel that it's somehow detracting from maybe more of a wild look, or removing elements that would be particularly attractive to pollinators or other, you know, living things in the garden?
Do you mean that hybrids can be, in some people's minds, something which is not belonging into an eco-conscious garden? No, because there are so many, or just a few people who can tell what is a hybrid and what is not a hybrid. So you really need experts from the designer's view.
Loads of hybrids in the wild. So
right.
Exactly.
If you think of orchids, I mean, if you go to a sand dune system and you look at the orchids, they're all hybrids. Perfectly good, perfectly, well, they're not sterile, so they're fertile, good for the insects. So I think natural hybrids occur anyhow.
Right.
And from my point of view, because I'm interested in the insects that pollinate and are part of the food chain, anything that's good for an insect, I'm happy with.
And since some insects and birds now fly longer distances, they would somewhen pollinate a certain plant with a different plant, that hybrids can occur in the wild. So gardening can speed evolution in a way.
Interesting. I want to kind of talk a little bit about the behind the scenes of a nursery for everyone here, and without getting too far into the weeds, pardon the pun, can you describe how growing in pots might require the use of organic material that would in some way inhibit the way a plant would work in a mostly sand-driven medium in a garden?
I grow in a medium, it's a bespoke mix, and it's got loam in it. It's more like garden soil. So I've got loam, I've got a lot of grit. I do have peat as my buffer. But most nurseries are in a lighter compost. One, because you tend to get a hernia if you pick a tray of my plants up. But mine is more like your garden compost. So, your garden soil. So when you plant, it's more likely to establish because it's easy to go out. I think a lot of the lighter composts tend to produce an awful lot of lush growth, so you get a lot of top and not so much root. I'm far more interested in having an iceberg effect. Lots of root, not so much top. And of course, that's what Peter gets in his sand, and growing yours hard, growing them lean. It means that you get less bruising. We're getting more winds nowadays, so the bruising then will attract aphids from over a mile away. Once you've got aphid trouble, you then start getting their sugar that comes out of their backsides, and then you get fungal problems, and you get secondary disease. So growing things lean, you can actually keep them in a much better, happier condition. So I would always use a very lean compost. And I think
when I had a nursery selling to people, I grew it in a compost. It was a third of peat, a third of sand, and a third of grit. So very heavy pots.
Yeah.
Yes.
But then now with landscaping, we just grow all our own plants just in pure sand. So it's just a frame with sand, and everything is bare-rooted and planted there, and then we just lift them when we need them.
Are you finding that...
Because I can't get the varieties I want in the quality I want. Because everything is grown in just too much good soil.
Right, so you're finding that these plants take off better in the ground.
Yeah, much easier to establish them. They are not
they
spoiled in the nursery first. So.
That's what we do, but they are slower to establish.
Yes.
So we swapped our potting soil completely some years ago. We are now on a organic soil, which is, let's say, 50% organic, 50% organic material and 50% stones and stuff like that. So that's much better for the plants. We don't have to spray anything anymore because aphids and so on are not a serious problem anymore. But for example, our hellebore breeding program slows down from a 3-year base to a 5-year now.
That's quite significant.
Yeah, it's very significant, but the plants are superb. So you do have hungry plants, and when a customer puts that into his own soil, they start to grow like mad. And I would even say if you use a plant like that for pure sand planting and wash off our soil, it is a bit quicker than a normal plant.
Yeah.
But do you feel you have to sort of justify that to your clients and explain?
Because they don't want to pay for that extra 2 years.
They don't want a lavender that big when they can buy one that big.
Exactly, or that wide. They don't want that big. They want all these little cuties full of flowers that size, but in a pot like that. That's what they want, the beasts. But but in my opinion, if you can make new customers at least one tray full of plants buy, and they plant then your plants in their gardens, and they see how your plants, which are not that tall or that full of flowers, but they are really, really good garden plants and flower year by year, they all will come back.
Yes. I mean, that is something that I hope to do with my customers, that I get a loyal following who realise that, my plants will survive.
They're quick.
But also, I didn't answer your question. Yes, of course, I would love to make a 0 after every price I wrote down, because 350 or 450 is nonsense for a plant which is not on a big scale commercial plant trade, but propagated by hand and in proper soil and without chemicals and so on. Yes, but can you?
3 years, 3 years instead of 3 months old.
Yeah.
They produce them in a plant factory somewhere.
Right. To that point, Peter, do you mind explaining how old these plants are in the photo? How long they've been?
They were planted this spring.
So they're 1 year old?
This first, and then the middle part is 2 years old.
How long to get plants from seed to a sellable state for all of you? Is it years?
Totally
it depends
depending
what
the
plant
plant
is.
Yeah, but you're
on
open to the idea of taking years to get plants.
Think of trilliums, for example.
Right.
It will take a...
I mean, bulbs in general, I would say, are probably 3 to 5 years to get to flower. Some herbaceous things like a nepeta, you could get it saleable in 1 year.
Yeah.
No tissue culture labs anywhere hidden.
No.
I was going to ask who's watering since we're all here, but I want to know, Peter, do you find that you're using less water growing in sand with this strategy?
We only watered the newly planted plants this year. So the plants in the middle, they didn't get any extra water this year.
Wow. Along those lines, how do you feel that your practices at the nursery and trying to get plants to establish and live longer term in gardens are ecologically friendly? Do you use chemicals? Do you travel great distances? How do you kind of understand the trade-offs of your work in trying to create spaces that feel ecological?
We try to do as much as we can, or as less as we can, you have to say, thinking of chemicals and water. But if you produce a plant, a herbaceous plant in a pot, that is already a problem. In former times, owners of herbaceous plants nurseries, they had just 2 selling seasons, autumn and spring. So everything was in the ground, and if you wanted to have asters or whatever, you had to come in spring or autumn, and then you got bare-rooted plants. That would be the perfect solution, but people want to just pop into a nursery and find something.
Sure.
So that...
With flower.
Yes.
Yeah, with flower.
Has to be in flower.
Yeah.
And if you dig up something because you are nice to your customers, you don't have that plant, and you said, okay, I go into the garden and dig it up, and of course you cut the flowers off or even the whole plant. They are shocked. Yes. So, because they wanted to have something like a bouquet and not a plant.
I always give them the flowers as well.
Nice, very nice. No, because I'm a florist and we are selling flowers, so they don't get them from me.
But I think when it comes to chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, we try and be as responsible as possible, but you also have to weigh up when you've got a garden that's open to the general public. So sometimes you have to use certain chemicals sparingly.
Are you using any chemicals?
No.
None.
And I don't use chemicals either.
Really great.
And also, from the green point of view, because I use this loam-based and high grit compost, I've been watering through this season about once every 36 hours. So I'm not using much water. I know that some nurseries have been watering 3 times a day. Now, the difference between 36 hours, 3 times a day, basically you're using a lot of water. It's all potable in Britain. We don't use our grey water. So I think I'm greener because I'm using less water. And in 2003, when we also had a hot summer, again, I felt that I was being greener doing that than using potable water when we were having hose bans and things like that. So I think water usage is very important. And you also find that you're not using much water.
No, just to establish
not
them.
Not at all. No.
Interesting. Do you find that, to your point about people only buying things in flower, that it's really hard to champion, for instance, summer dormant things that are really important for a lot of the work that we've seen today? And how do you go about selling an empty pot to a person?
It is very difficult unless you got really keen customers, and we got geranium malviflorum in the gravel garden, which is looking fantastic in late spring, and then you tell people that it's going to look great now for another couple of weeks, and then it's going to go dormant over the summer, and people just put the pot back.
Wow.
Yeah. But if it's a true plant enthusiast, I'm sure they will buy the plant.
And sometimes it helps to make a story out of it. If you explain how wonderful evolution is, because this plant is adopted to a condition where it has to lose its leaves. It doesn't make sense to have leaves in the summer like geranium malviflorium or tuberosum. Then you may get them on a different path.
And also, if you say that it will leave a gap for something later flowering like agapanthus, people are more likely to be interested in having it in their own garden. So I think it's about sort of advising and getting people to see the possibilities rather than just saying that, sorry, but it's going to die down in a couple of weeks' time.
But to be true, people who come in nurseries like ours are already a selection of certain people. These are not the ordinary people who go into the garden center.
This is a cult that James was talking about.
Yeah.
This is our cult.
Yeah, true.
I wonder if each of you might take a minute or two, we'll see how much time we have for any other questions, to talk about the need for more research or trialing to get better plants into the trade. You grow your own plants because you feel that there really are no better options.
Yeah.
So maybe we could start with you and work the way down.
But there is so many more plants I want to grow.
Okay.
That was short and sweet.
That's all right. I mean, it's a good answer.
So what was the question?
Yeah,
again?
so where do you see the need for more research and trialing and work to be done with getting better plants into the trade?
I think it's just the risk of the demand for plants that are looking good in the pot. We're not a garden centre, none of us here, so it is very different. But we just need to keep encouraging people to look for plants that got a longer life, not something that's going to look fantastic for a year and then just die. And I think I don't know. We trust our friends and colleagues a lot as well when it comes to trialing plants. So it's about the community and exchanging experiences, discussing what works, what doesn't work. And I think that's how we get hold of the best of the plants.
But we have loads of garden plants that works in garden conditions, but all these new ways of my roof gardens and green walls and rain gardens, we need new plants for that. At the moment, we're just testing what we already have and see what's working. But you can really growing plants for these new kind of plantings.
That's a great point.
That's necessary.
Growing them in a specific pot size.
And soil and everything.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And in my garden, it just happens because I like to change some parts of my garden. If I do have a new idea, maybe I change a garden which was framed by a hedge for something new. So it doesn't have got a hedge anymore, it's more windy, or in one case, I show pictures of that tomorrow. I had an enormous boxwood hedge which doesn't work anymore, so now I do have a cotton steel frame, and that is much hotter, so conditions change, and trialing of plants is completely different with the new idea I installed.
Marina, how about you? Where do you see the direction?
Like Peter, I want to grow all sorts of different plants, and I'm fortunate enough to have various designers come to me for plants for Chelsea. And if they're working with an Iranian garden or Jordanian, I'm sometimes given lists. I've never seen the plants before, but I will source seeds, grow them, and some of them have turned out to be wonderful plants. And so I'm adding to the assortment that I have all the time. They've all got to be good for my pollinators. I'm always interested in insects. I'm particularly interested in umbellifers at the moment, and would like to write a book on them. And so I'm growing all sorts of things from any wild collections that I can get hold of. So it's a constant trialing of new plants for me, because I don't want to use the same plants all the time.
Very cool. So we have kind of a couple of minutes here, time for one more question. I thought it was interesting, Peter, that you mentioned Dixter being an inspiration, because the style of planting there has kind of been contrasted to a lot of the work described today. It's much more labor intensive, for instance. So I wonder if any of you are thinking about this hybrid way to incorporate amplified moments into your work. Do you work potentially with annuals or geophytes? And how do you see the maintenance strategy of all of that playing out longer term?
I think we will use annuals and biannuals quite a lot, just as gap fillers, to change the picture from year to year as well. We don't really do any bedding, but we do have agaves that we move out to the gravel garden, but we do overwinter them frost-free. They probably would survive, but they wouldn't look particularly nice in spring. But apart from that, we don't really... Most of the plants that go in the ground stay there. It's perennial plants and shrubs.
Yeah, we can't copy Dixter and we can't copy Armenia, but we can make a version of it that fits us.
Yeah.
So just get the inspiration from everywhere.
I feel that I get huge inspiration from Dixter, but it is so high maintenance, it's not feasible for an awful lot of people. So you can take things from it, you can take plants from it, because there's always new plants being trialled. Yes. I love self-seeders, I love gravel gardens, like to see what's coming up. And editing and the dynamic approach to gardening and getting new things, but the editing's really important. In a gravel garden, you can't let it just self-seed, so there's no way through. You need to edit all the time. But sometimes you get most wonderful effects.
Right.
And Dixter was for me such a great inspiration as well. But I didn't want to do all these things with my soil, and I cannot afford it, and I don't see the sense in doing it, but I loved these beds full and full and full of plants and with flamboyant combinations. So we heard quite a lot of layers before today, and I discussed that with Beth together, and she said that you have to garden in layers but in the soil. And that works quite well with us. So I try to put as many plants on top of each other, bulbs and culms and annuals and perennials and grasses, and of course some are competition very quickly, but in other cases these combinations are astonishingly stable.
Yes. I think that is the perfect note to end on before we go check out this wonderful nursery and garden. So thank you all for your points of view.
Thank you.